Hi and welcome. My name is Emma Storbacka and I'll take you through approximately 30 minutes of best practices for how to become data-driven at scale. So at Avaus, we have been building our methodology for the last 15 years, working with hundreds and hundreds of Nordic enterprises, all at the same quest. How can we use data, automation, and AI to actually improve our P&L and our business performance? So what follows next is an overview of the methodology that we suggest and work with our clients, but also some advice on how you as a leader should think about data-drivenness and your role in creating success for your team. So let's start by looking at the operating model. What we've learned over the last 15 years is that becoming data-driven is actually much more complex than one would think. And probably you need to get at least these 40 things right that we have mapped into what we call the data-driven operating model. And I'm not going to go through all of these here today, but what we're going to look at are the things that you as leaders at least need to make sure is happening when you're setting yourself up for this challenge. So we need to look at how do we define ambition? How do we look at what type of revenue data and automation should be generating? How do we work across channels to scale automation? What is a use case and how do we map the sheer number of use cases that we need to have in place against our revenue targets? And then how do we measure and follow up on success? And then we're going to have a few things on change management at the very last part of this presentation. So let's get started from the business. A really good advice that we always say is that you need to be able to speak about data-drivenness on CFO terms. And the way that you do this is that you start with the business drivers and you create a value waterfall, as we call it. You need to identify where in the business you are able to generate incremental, measurable potential into your P&L. And most likely, you're going to find that you're going to be able to do better customer acquisition. You're going to be able to support cross and upselling or retention. You're probably going to be able to also reduce waste in your media buying that you then can, for example, turn into more efficient acquisition of the right customers. And you might be cutting costs in customer service, for example. These are typical value drivers that you would address. And then you end in a sort of number on incremental EBITDA or incremental profitability on an annualized basis. And this would be at your target automation level. So when you actually have become data-driven. This is really critical because the next step is to start listing use cases that addresses each of these value buckets. And the way that you do this is that you probably have a long list and then you shortlist and prioritize based on what's going to make most sense for your business. But now comes the beauty of, and the most maybe important part of this approach that we advocate. And that is that you need to map the target automation level. So what actually will generate business impact for you is whether you have automated data-driven activities where you actually meet the customer. So in the channels that you meet your customer. And they can be communication channels, it can be CRM, it can be telemarketing, it can be your customer center or contact center, whatever it is. But if there is no data activation, which is automated into the channel, you will not have any impact from the data. And this is the difference from going from insights drivenness, which is looking at the dashboard and making better decisions, all the way to becoming data-driven, which implies that you actually, with data, are driving your business, which again, you can measure through the automation level. Now, all use cases or application areas of using data and automation, you won't want to do in all channels, for example. They will not really be relevant in all channels. And by mapping these based on the relevance and where you think it's going to add value, you're going to land in a target automation level, which here in this slide is 116. 116 is super low in most enterprise cases that we work with. the number is closer to 1,000. If you think about all of the markets, the channels, maybe the different offerings and the different sales teams that you want to influence with data. Now, why is this number important? Because we're going to come back to this target automation level number several times. Well, unless you really focus on this number, you're going to do a lot of mistakes that we see happening often. So what are those, for example? So the first mistake is that you are focusing only on a few low-hanging fruits. For example, you choose one or two use cases that become the sort of dominating part of your roadmap. And that will imply then that you create technical capabilities and an operating model that does not support actually becoming data-driven. It only supports those few use cases. The other mistake that we often see, especially in quite large and siloed organizations, is that you become data-driven, but only from one channel. You, for example, are super good at using data and automation in email and SMS, so your own channels, typically within the CRM team. And you might be super good at using some data for, let's say, paid channels, but that's not the same data, and it's not the same marketing that goes out to all of those customers. So you lose out on customer experience, and of course, also the efficiency of creating this automation level. Mistake number 3 here is that you don't actually do the math. So unless you actually have mapped out what do you mean by being data-driven, how will that look like in all channels, but also in all BUs or markets or offerings, you risk not actually making a budget that will hold the potential or take you to the full potential that you have mapped out in the first instance. So this also keeps you honest on what you actually need. And then the last part is that if you haven't thought about that you're going to have hundreds or maybe thousands of automated growth driving processes that each generate incremental revenue and EBITDA for you, then probably also haven't organized for having somebody who owns this number, or having a team that actually is focused on maintaining and improving algorithms, automations, content, whatever is flowing through these pipelines. And unless you think about this number, you're most likely going to be under-resourcing that, at least in the medium term. So that is why this target automation level is so critical. Oh yeah, sorry. You also avoid one more mistake, which is from a management level, maybe the most important. You should be organizing your whole program or initiative around making sure that you focus on the big picture. Individual use cases matter less. Your ability to systematically implement and automate use cases towards your target automation level, that's what actually is going to matter a lot. So when you then have this target automation level mapped out, then you can start making plans for, well, when do we think we will reach the target automation level? So when are we actually delivering all of this value that we have identified? And you have to also be quite honest to yourself on that in the first year. Probably you're not going to have time to deliver almost any value because you're probably building a little bit of capabilities. You haven't rigged your organization or your sort of use case factory to actually churn out automations at scale. And also, even though you crack those things in the first year, the use cases you implement by the end of your financial year, they're not going to have time to generate any incremental revenue for you in that year. Let's say it goes live in October, it would only be pushing results for October, November, and December. But making this plan and having a clear view of when will we get to certain target automation level also helps you do the financial modeling of how will this pay itself back. And once you do that financial modeling, you also realize that the beauty of this is the business case is typically very good. So we would say that normally you should expect a payback of 12 to 18 months. That's how you should resource your first year. And you should think about that each batch of use cases will remain and generate value for the years to come. There will be some decay, of course, in the models and the use cases. They need to be maintained, but mainly they also need to be improved. We don't recommend going full force on all use cases from the start, but rather try to get to 75% of your target automation level first, and then add more granularity, improve the algorithms, do more personalization, do more channels if you need to, so that you get to scale as soon as possible. And then you will see that the results stack year by year, and the business case for doing data-driven and automated revenue processes is quite good. So with these types of number exercises and plans that you can sign off with your financial team, you should have a pretty good foundation to work against and to also hold yourself accountable for. So how do you then organize yourself for scaling towards that target automation level? So first of all, one case example that demonstrates that the faster you get to scale, the better your business case is going to be. And this is a little bit illogical, or it's counterintuitive for how most would want to invest in these things. So we quite often see that you want to do like one or two use cases to see that this works, and then you scale from there. But that's actually a very bad business case in most situations. So if you believe in that data-driven processes are going to improve your sales, it makes more sense to be a bit front-heavy and then take down the pace, or maybe find a balance. And just to demonstrate this, here are three scenarios. So one scenario is a steady pace. You have 3 FTEs churning out capabilities and use cases in a steady pace. Then you have a sort of more heavy upfront investment, going 5 FTEs in the first year and then coming down to 3 FTEs. And then the third one is a pivot where you do low-hanging fruits first, switch the team, continue with 3 FTEs investment level to build capabilities, and then switch back to more use cases. And on a chart, and these are real numbers for a client of ours, on a chart, it would look something like this. So you would have the second scenario getting to target automation level much faster than in the other cases. And if you run the numbers for this, the incremental revenue, at at year 3 is going to be more than double in scenario 2 versus scenario 1. So the faster you get to automation, the better the business case on a 3-year level is going to be. Not for the first year, but on a 3-year level. So that's some thinking and financial modeling that needs to be done. That doesn't mean that in any of the scenarios you wouldn't get to pay back in the first year. It just has to do with like how much faster do you get to the target automation level. And this is, I think, one of the most critical mistakes that you can make, and that is that you sort of don't do the math for how much resourcing am I going to need to get to the target automation level. So quite often we see companies over-investing in the tech capabilities track over here, and under-investing in creating the use cases. Whereas that's actually the biggest part of your investment, most likely. And especially if you're in a situation where you're about to implement a new technical foundation, marketing automation platform, CDP, customer data capability, this part here is quite often not counted for at all. However, that's a piece that's going to bring you the incremental business results. Then we also have another area here that you need to think about, and that's the whole operating model and change management part, which is quite big when it comes to becoming data-driven. And we'll talk more about that in a while. Over time as well, you're going to need to invest more and more in actually maintaining your portfolio of automated use cases. And that's also something we see that you haven't really thought about. Who's going to own this? How are they going to be incentivized? How do you even build an organization around thousands of automated sales driving, sort of almost synthetic salespeople? And in most organizations, there's no natural home for that, and there's no natural KPI setting for that, even though it's going to be a significant part of your sales and EBITDA. The other mistake we often see happening is that you assume that just because you have the technology and the data, perhaps, everybody will just show up and magically create use cases. Now, these use cases, on average, in an enterprise setting, touch maybe 20 to 25 people, from business casing to planning to execution to testing to reporting to follow up and iterations and optimization. And that's a little bit like, if you would think about going to the gym and wanting to have all of your friends there at the same time for, working out with you. That's a hard thing to get into the calendars. Well, this is even harder. So imagine you have to do that, times 116 to get to where you want to be. How fit would you be? You wouldn't be very fit. So organizing around like this complexity of people, organizations, silos, times 116, that is the critical piece for getting the results. And the way to do that is partly that you actually plan how you're going to scale. So each organization is going to be slightly different. In some, you want to scale based on channels. In some, you want to scale based on value driver. In some, you want to scale based on markets. And it has a lot to do with the stakeholder dynamics of your organization. But if you roadmap and plan again with the same framework, the target automation level, and you use, for example, this type of color coding, you will also be more granular in terms of when do we expect what type of benefit. And this exercise is absolutely critical. It's not an operational topic, it's a highly strategic topic. How do we scale? In what order? Then once you have figured that out, then of course you need to get to a pretty high pace of developing these use cases. And each use case typically has, probably 10 to 15 different types of competencies attached. And you need to do quite a lot of them every month. In most organizations that we encounter, doing one automated flow per quarter would feel like a massive win. So you have to get to a pace which is 10x or 20x what you have today. And that's also the mindset that you're going to have to put into the people's heads that are working with this. This is also the reason that we call our methodology factory, because you have to create the process that just churns out use cases in a systematic way with no people dependencies and very high and improving throughputs. So in the best of worlds, this is actually what your throughput is going to look like. So in the beginning, you do maybe a bit slower use cases, but then as you gain more automations, you get also more agentic workflows in how you create automations and how you measure them and so on. Then you can actually increase or say reduce the effort per use case and also thus increase the ROI of use cases. And of course, you would probably continue with this data-driven process until your marginal cost for creating one new meets your marginal benefit. So even though your first map tells you that your target automation level is 116, for example, when you redo that exercise, maybe every year or biannually, you're going to find that there's a lot more to do. So you will never be done. This is not a project. This is an ongoing work that you're going to do for the rest of your career. Then you also need to, of course, have some baselines and measure how long does it actually take for us to create one use case. Because this is one of the key metrics that you as a leader are going to want to follow. How many use cases can we churn out per year? And how much is that improving year on year? And as long as that number is increasing, then your operating model seems to be doing fine. A really good indicator of operating model health is how many use cases you get out and whether that is improving or not. And just to give one example again, with Viking Line, what we've seen is creating this end-to-end flow for a use case from planning all the way to optimization. It probably is more than 10 competences needed to do each use case, and also more than 20 people that somehow need to be involved in this process. So getting these kind of fractional roles in place where everybody can sort of come in and out on the factory line, so to say, is really, really critical. Otherwise, you're going to have massive bottlenecks or people that you have recruited or somehow gotten into your team sitting idle, and you don't want that, of course. Now, what makes all of this really interesting now going forward is, of course, the advance of AI. And we are experiencing this as we go right now. We are going to have a lot of AI agents and helpers doing, advising us on how to do things better. We're also going to have certain parts of the process which are completely outsourced or done by AI agents or helpers. And these are a few examples just of how we do this together with a few of our clients. So in steel manufacturing, we have a client where we're designing basically the organization to have certain agents that are kind of covering roles in the organization. So one is, for example, a agent which is just basically looking at market potential and informing if you see an interesting market development or new leader opportunity happening, for example, a project development happening. You can also have, for example, certain roles that are doing only specifications or only a use case documentation agent. For example, we have developed for one client that wanted to document automate the documentation process. So planning the operating model in this way, where we actually think about which parts are going to be human-led and which not, are going to, of course, speed up the way that we create use cases in the future. The other aspect is, how do we do process design so that we have humans in the loop? So we can have these AI helpers that can sort of answer to questions and so on, but then we also want to do these fairly deterministic workflows where we do one thing many times. For example, plan and productionalize a new use case. We want to do that in a workflow where we, for example, start by discussing the business need, and then going all the way into, okay, how do we build a use case? How do we specify it? Are we happy with that? We humans put it all the way to solution architecture and code. We kind of maybe approve the architecture. We push the code and it goes live with a manual check before we hit the button. This is the direction that your operating model needs to go. No company is here yet, so this is sort of the future state. But you need to start planning in this direction so that you can scale at a more and more efficient pace in the future. All right, 2 sections left, measuring and then change management. So let's take a few looks on measurement. This is going to be fairly short. But one thing that we see is really, really useful is that, of course, you're going to measure on the automation level. So the target automation level that you have defined and how that pace is then on the roadmap. So are you getting to automation level you need? And that's actually the best thing to track in year 1. Because you want to get to high automation early enough. So set all of the targets for year 1 on automation level, but start measuring also the uplift in sales. And in all cases, there is going to be some level of leap of faith needed. So you as a leader need to make sure measurements and targets are in place, but don't make progress dependent on whether those measurements are happening fast enough. If you think your company needs to become more data-driven, then you need to point maybe towards year 3 and the ambition level there, and your team will get you there. If you have an agreed definition of success on a medium to long-term basis, then it's quite easy to also create this incentive model where you start tracking different things and also maybe setting goals for your team, but also for your vendors. And in the case of working with Avaus, we love to put success-based fees. So discounting some of our fees to then be able to earn them back when we hit the commonly agreed milestones. That helps everybody know that we are doing, that we as a team together are putting everything at play to make sure that progress is as fast as possible, business results are as good as possible, and change management is done as well as possible. This is the way that we, for example, have structured our collaboration with one Nordic electronics retailer. So then when you start following up on these numbers to your management team or your board or whoever is interested, then we should revert to these same pictures that we had in the beginning. So the value waterfall, and when do we think we will reach the goals, as well as how are we progressing on the target automation level. In that way, you will create a language that doesn't require that everybody understands all of the different details on personalization or AI or algorithms, but really kind of two simple metrics: incremental sales and the automation level and how that is improving. You should also really try to avoid all kind of technical jargon and talking about, for example, implementation of different platforms. That is not relevant. Only the use cases are relevant. And then whether a platform implementation is taking time and that's what's blocking, fine. But use cases out there, that is what we are interested in tracking. We see way too many steering group meetings, for example, which are around, let's say, MarTech stacks, where nobody is talking about use cases. And that's the only thing that the business people in the room should be asking for all the time. So then the last part here, managing change and doing that from the start. This is a bit awkward because quite often we get into situations where change management is brought up, but the elephant in the room is that those who talk about the change management are actually the ones who need to change the most. So all studies also show that, especially in this age of AI, specialist levels and blue-collar workers have the easiest time adopting to AI. Middle management and executive management have the hardest time adopting. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the skill sets and the way that you build your work as a manager or leader. That is all changing when we go towards more automation. So this is something called the MarTech's law, developed by Scott Brinker, and it states that there's a growing knowledge gap between the exponentially growing technology capabilities and the logarithmically growing organization development. And as a leader in this data-driven space, this is kind of your main thing to think about. How are you going to move that slow-moving organizational line, a few nudges higher? You can do that through a program. You can do that through an outsourcing movement. You can do it through organizational change. But the fact is that it's going to be a lot of value which is out there, technically available for you, and your ability to shift and speed up the shift of your organization's development, which is going to make all of the difference. So when thinking about how to address these things, spend enough time discussing your organization and approach to make that organizational change happen. Technical platforms, what use cases, what algorithms, all of that is sort of commoditizing almost. But the part where we need to spend more time typically is this lower bar over here. Now then, when you plan for change management, the change that we need to create is different in the different levels of the organization. And on the C-level and middle management, it's going to be a bigger change, as said, but it's also going to be different types of change processes. So for specialists or more operational roles in the organization, you can do learning by doing, you can do formal training, you can communicate about what you want. But then when you come up here, we're going to have much more complex topics, which are also slower to change. For example, how you set people's incentives and bonus targets, for instance. How you set your strategy for your company. Automation will create completely new ways of value generation, and the old truths of how we go to market, how we build revenue, how we build a customer base, all of that is changing. And that also means that probably at some point, all of this data, AI, and automation needs to be kind of quite firmly embedded into your strategy process. So these are some of the methods and some of the changes that need to happen. Of course, the plan needs to be much more granular like than this, but maybe a few foods for thought. So coming to the end of this short presentation, a summary. First of all, make sure that you speak the language of the CFO. Create your use case-based roadmap and set the targets for target automation level. Plan and resource for getting to scaled automation, which also includes investments in how do you actually do this organizational change, how do you actually make sure that the factory line is set up. Make sure that you build all this operating model and ways of working in a way that AI can easily be used to replace and augment parts of that. So think about your operating model also as architecture. Make sure that you measure automation first to drive high automation level early, and then make sure that you add kind of incremental revenue as the second main metric. And then do take change management seriously and realize that this is not something that is about upskilling operative people how they work. That probably also is partly needed, but the big shifts here are around how do you strategize around organizational change and getting to a new way of working across your organization. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, just DM me on LinkedIn, and happy to speak more about this. Now you got a brief overview. There's much more underneath this, so let me know. Hello, 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 hello. And we're going to try this again. Hello, 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 hello.